Thank you for having me here. I'm trained as an organizational psychologist, but I teach in a business school, Texas A&M Business School. And really what that means is I'm interested in kind of the psychological underpinnings of why people create value in organizations. Kind of the flip side of that coin being a business school, and I'm also going to show some of these people over here because everyone's stuck over there. Another thing that I really try and do with my life's work is try and articulate the actual value that people bring to businesses. I was talking to many of you are in marketing. Sometimes from a disciplinary perspective, I'm jealous of my colleagues in the marketing department because their focus on customers allows them to create a really easy business case, right? Because the customers pay money directly to the organization. So if we want an initiative to get more customers, it's very easy to kind of articulate the value that's being provided, and it's not the same in HR. But there's a lot we can do. And I teach a people analytics class, and it's something that's a passion of mine, trying to really put a dollar value. So I'm going to talk a little bit about both of those things today. An anecdote I'll share with you really quickly. Back in 2005, I worked for Merck, a pharmaceutical company, and my boss, he talked about a person who quit recently, and he literally said the words, "He's dead to me." And I was like, whoa, okay. And it was clear, they talked about it like their blood running green, because Merck was like a green logo or something like that. And me coming in fresh out of college, I was like, I'm here because you like my resume more than Novartis. That's the reason I'm here, right? I don't see this type of and I thought it was even like kind of a brainwash cult type thing. Fast forward 2 years later, he was laid off, this particular manager, who had been there since he graduated, by the way, for about 20 years. And I witnessed as a bystander, this kind of lack of loyalty, right? That went one way but didn't go the other. And it shaped the way I viewed the larger employer-employee relationship more broadly. And I think most of us living through the 90s and 2000s were downsizing events, increased, and now they're just basically hovering around, very prevalent, right? We've all been a part of something like that, and so that's what got me to kind of view this relationship as something more lifelong, right? And people should be treated as humans, right? And there's a real business case for it. When I talk about alumni culture, so again, I mentioned I'm an organizational psychologist. Back in the 80s, people started conceptualizing organizational culture, drawing on anthropology work on national culture. And they started to talk about, what are the ends, what leads to culture in organizations. And it's a lot of things, but the way I'm going to define it is kind of this shared perception between all relevant stakeholders that alumni carry value. It's represented in kind of unspoken norms, as well as kind of shared assumptions. When I do X in this organization, Y happens, because I've seen it happen over and over again. So if I was to rehire somebody, what's the response? Are people excited? Are people weird? Are people kind of like, well, they quit on us, why are they, when they come back? So it's this shared assumptions. It's kind of underneath, right? It's things that we sometimes don't even know we think. They can be implicit assumptions that are embedded in this belief that alumni carry value. So what we want to proliferate, as well as investing in an alumni program and network, etc., we want a culture where people are going to have behavior motivated because it's a norm, right? And so the way that I kind of think of this is I break it down into 3 periods that are kind of associated with 3 salient groups of people and their actions that can be taken in the pre-departure periods of the current employees, and then after exit, and then of course I think all of this is shaped by what I call the exit transition. When they say I'm quitting to when they leave, that's a very salient time, which I'm going to spend a little bit about. So, and this is shared, right? This is between current employees, alumni, managers are very important in playing this role as well. So again, I think there are informal and formal things that organizations do to create this culture of alumni, kind of a positive. It's kind of the perception that there's value in alumni relationships. And so I said these 3 periods here. So I want to I think this is also a framework that any organization can kind of do an audit and say, okay, how are we thinking about our current employees? And I say pre-departure because it goes along with this assumption that everyone's going to leave sometime, right, at some point. But do you involve current employees in your alumni program? That's a question we're going to talk about a little bit more in a minute. Are they given access? Are they encouraged to interact? Do you talk about it at onboarding your alumni program, right? So from the very beginning, is there this installation of values associated with alumni? The exit transition, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in depth in a second, but as managers, they're the ones who kind of facilitate what happens in this salient period. And I believe that this is kind of I think it was Adrian who said meaningful moments. There's a speaker, right? I gotta be over here. He said meaningful moments, right, that happen in organizations. The moment I say I'm quitting is a meaningful moment, right, when it comes to my alumni journey. So I love that M&S has some formalized things that are in place around the exit transition. There needs to be, I believe, because that really shapes the way in which this plays out. And then, of course, how you deal with alumni. That's what we've been talking about kind of all day. So I want to talk about this really quickly. Managing the exit transition. This is shaped by a lot of things. Not everyone is a regrettable turnover. Maybe, I don't know, but people leave in different ways. The manager is the one who's usually the one hearing the news. I think it's important to get in the shoes of the person who's quitting. I think there's a lot of people who feel guilty when they quit. I think there's a lot of people who are worried about that conversation. I know when I quit to go back to graduate school, my boss, he looked, so I told him I'm quitting, and he immediately said, you know what, Matt, because I told him I was going to graduate. He's like, you know what, you're going to do great at that. I'm so excited for you. And immediately I was like, wow, he didn't have to say that, but I felt such a validation as a human, right? At that moment when I felt like he didn't disown me or he wasn't mad at me. But the problem is managers actually are not, the incentives aren't set up for them to do that, right? Because they're the ones that is the biggest pain, right? When someone quits, right? They have to deal with the vacancy. They have to find a new person. They have to, and so it's very easy just going by their incentive if you don't have a culture or kind of policies in place around the exit transition for them to get annoyed and for them to be, okay, you're leaving, right? And so I think it's important to manage these type of things because I think it's you don't want to have that type of mentality, right, in your organization by anyone. And you can espouse a value, we know this, right? You can espouse a value from top management, and it does not have to be enacted by middle management, right? If their incentives aren't aligned, and that's even worse, because people are like, you talk the talk, but you don't walk the walk. And so managers, line managers play a big role in that. So I want to talk about this different types of social capital. When I mean social capital, I define that as kind of the value that is inherent in relationships, and we've talked about that a ton. When you set up an alumni program, I think it's interesting to think about it as, okay, we have an alumni program that connects us as a company to people, but do you connect your current employees? I think is an important question, and about a third of companies don't. Right? You don't even really know about the alumni program until you say, I'm quitting, well, hey, join the alumni program. But the majority of companies do actually involve them, right? So I think it's an important question, why do we not, if we're not doing it? And so I think there actually are some reasons why at least people are thinking they don't, and maybe for everyone, maybe they shouldn't. But I want to talk real briefly about what are some of the benefits and perhaps some risks, right? The benefits are, I would argue that a lot of the resources that travel back to organizations travel back through the relationships with current employees. So it's business development. They're more likely to offer you a new business opportunity if they know someone at your company and they've had coffee with them recently, or they just are friends with them, right? If they don't know anyone at your company and they're part of an alumni association and they don't have an actual connection beyond just being an alum, I think it's less likely if they don't know a current employee. So that's one opportunity. But I think there's less monitoring of that resource exchange when it happens kind of one-on-one, right? Another thing is that it's easier to transition from employee to alumni. Okay, they already know that it exists. They're a part of kind of, if they're invited to the activities, they know, and so yes, they'll most likely do it. But also I think it might be seen as easier to quit too, right? Because I think some people legitimately worry about the fact that if I'm given like a high five on the way out and a party's thrown for me, it's like, maybe I'm not gonna worry about quitting myself. And if I'm talking to these people who are alums and having a great, something else, maybe I'll go ahead and get poached, right? So that's a legitimate concern that I think, needs to be monitored. And this idea of information transfer, talked about that. But there's also risks, right? You can tell your alumni about jobs, but they can also tell your current employees about jobs, right? So that kind of goes both ways. Well, what do you do about these risks? Well, I would argue that in the absence of kind of formal monitoring mechanisms, because we can't really monitor alum, right? They don't have a responsibility to us in any way. That is culture, right? That leads people to do the right thing. And essentially what we're doing when we're creating an alumni network is providing this, you're investing in them, right? And you're kind of saying, I'm taking the first step, and maybe even exposing myself to a little bit of vulnerability, but you'll do the right thing back, right? Because we are investing in you. And so I think when that shared culture is there, there's less opportunity. At least that's what the data would suggest. All right, so I want to shift gears, and then they'll both come together at the end of this 5 minutes. What we actually say about employees are our most valuable asset. But how we actually treat them is that they're our biggest cost, right? And even the GAP guidelines would suggest that that's how business leaders see employees. You want to reduce costs, you downsize. I'd like to borrow a framework that's in the marketing literature and also universe about customer lifetime values. This basically is just this algorithm that says when we gain a customer, we don't just gain that one sale we made. We should think of them as something over their lifetime being able to purchase a certain amount, and the length of that customer relationship can be calculated, and actually can do a net present value for anyone in finance. You can discount it, basically say their net present value is this. Well, so I'm starting in academic literature, but this also kind of exists out there in the HR space of this idea of employee lifetime value. Okay, so it's essentially drawing on the same principles that marketing folks have drawn on to say we should be able to calculate the value of an employee. And so this is some of the frameworks that you can just kind of Google this. This is not mine. But it's trying to look at this idea that, when people come in, they are a cost in terms of even their output and their productivity. But eventually they fully contribute, and as we know, eventually they leave. I think the big question and the leap we need to make from CLTV to ELV is this output, okay, turning that into a dollar amount. And I believe you can, but it's outside the scope of this talk, and you can talk to me after about it. But we need to learn to do that. And it's specific to your role, specific to the role of employee, and to your company, and to your market. But when you look at it this way, I think it changes the way that you approach investments, right, in your human capital. And it makes you think less about them as a cost and more about them as, these are the people who are creating the value. We add an alumni network to that, and then we have a very easy case to say, well, this actually doesn't exist as much, right, with rehires. They can come in fully contributing. And then there's also not a complete zero value added back on the back end, right? And so I think these two things kind of come together to help, again, make the business case for that. Anyway, that's all I got. 5 minutes. I'm trying to keep on time here.
Thank you very much.